History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now. You probably think you've heard the most disturbing stories from ancient history, right? Brutal executions, horrific plagues, violent battles that left thousands dead on ancient battlefields. Well, prepare to have your perception of historical horror completely shattered. Because what you're about to discover is so grotesquely repugnant and physically impossible that it challenged everything. Ancient Egyptians believed about death, the afterlife, and the divine nature of their pharaohs. We're talking about the only documented case in human history where a human corpse literally exploded during a state funeral, in front of thousands of horrified witnesses with such devastating force that pieces of royal flesh were scattered across sacred temple grounds and chunks of decomposed Pharaoh had to be scraped off the faces of high priests, who were standing hundreds of feet away from the explosion site. Here's the first fact that will blow your mind. This was only some minor local ruler whose death went unnoticed. We're talking about one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs, whose funeral was attended by representatives from across the known world. Diplomats, foreign royalty, military commanders, and religious leaders who traveled for months to pay their respects to what they believed was a living god. Instead, they witnessed what ancient chroniclers described as the most terrifying demonstration of divine wrath ever witnessed by mortal eyes. But wait, it gets infinitely more disturbing. The explosion didn't happen quietly or privately where it could be covered up by palace officials. This occurred during the most sacred moment of the entire funeral ceremony, when the pharaoh's mummified body was being presented to the gods for final blessing before eternal interment. Thousands of witnesses watched in absolute horror as their supposedly divine ruler's corpse suddenly swelled to impossible proportions, made sounds that ancient texts describe as the screaming of demons, and then detonated with such force that the golden sarcophagus was blown into pieces that embedded themselves in temple walls. And that's what makes this truly historically significant. The explosion was so traumatic and unexpected that it fundamentally changed Egyptian religious beliefs about pharaohs and the afterlife. For over 3,000 years, Egyptians had believed their rulers were living gods whose bodies were sacred vessels that would carry them to eternal paradise. In one horrifying moment, that entire belief system was shattered as witnesses saw their divine pharaoh reduced to scattered chunks of rotting flesh that had to be collected with shovels and book. The eyewitness accounts from this event are some of the most detailed and disturbing documents in ancient Egyptian history. High priests described the smell as worse than 1,000 rotting corpses left in the desert sun, while foreign diplomats wrote home about witnessing the gods themselves reject a pharaoh in the most violent way imaginable. Some witnesses developed what we would now recognize as severe PTSD, refusing to ever enter a temple again and abandoning their religious beliefs, entirely after seeing what they interpreted as proof that even pharaohs could be cursed by forces beyond human understanding. But here's the most chilling part. This explosion wasn't an isolated incident of ancient weirdness. It was the inevitable result of specific circumstances that created the perfect conditions for a human body to become a biological bomb. The pharaoh's lifestyle, his physical condition at death, the mummification process used on his corpse, and the environmental conditions during the funeral ceremony combined to create what was essentially a ticking time bomb made of decomposing royal flesh. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about ancient Egyptian burial practices, the real physical condition of pharaohs behind their godlike propaganda, and how natural biological processes can create horror that surpasses any supernatural explanation. This is UNT mythology or religious allegory. This is documented historical fact about how one pharaoh's death became the most traumatic public spectacle in ancient Egyptian history and proved that even gods can explode when the right conditions are met. If you're expecting this to be some obscure minor pharaoh whose name history forgot, prepare for a shock that will destroy everything you thought you knew about one of Egypt's most celebrated rulers. We're talking about Amenhotep III, the pharaoh who ruled during Egypt's Golden Age, commissioned some of the most magnificent temples and monuments in ancient history, and is remembered by historians as one of the most successful and powerful rulers in Egyptian civilization. The same man whose reign represented the absolute peak of Egyptian wealth, culture, and international influence literally exploded during his own funeral, because his lifestyle had transformed him into a walking biological disaster. Here is the truth that will completely shatter the heroic image. Amenhotep III was once the majestic god king, depicted in temple carvings and Hollywood movies. By the time of his death, he had become so grotesquely obese that his actual weight was estimated by modern forensic experts to be over 400 pounds. In an era when the average Egyptian man weighed maybe 120 pounds. His mummy, when finally examined by archaeologists, revealed a man whose body had been so distorted by obesity that his internal organs had been crushed by his own body weight for years before his death. But wait. The reality of his physical condition gets infinitely more disturbing. Contemporary medical papyri describe Amenhotep III suffering from what we now know were severe symptoms of morbid obesity combined with diabetes, heart disease, and multiple organ failures. Ancient Egyptian doctors wrote detailed accounts of the pharaoh's inability to walk without assistance, his constant breathing difficulties, and skin conditions that caused his flesh to literally rot while he was still alive. Palace servants reported that his legs had swollen to such enormous proportions that special furniture had to be constructed just to support his weight. And here's the truly grotesque part. Amenhotep III's obesity wasn't just due to overeating. It was the result of a lifestyle so decadent and excessive that it defied every natural limit of human consumption. Palace records document daily feasts that included hundreds of different dishes, enough food to feed entire villages, and exotic delicacies imported from across the known world. He consumed massive quantities of honey, beer, and fermented fruit drinks that kept his body in a constant state of alcohol-induced bloating and fermentation. The pharaoh's eating habits had become so extreme that he required teams of servants working in shifts just to keep him fed throughout the day and night. Ancient texts describe meals that lasted 4 hours, with Amenhotep III consuming whole roasted animals. Dozens of different breads and cakes, and quantities of liquid that would be impossible for a normal human digestive system to process. His body had essentially become a fermentation tank, constantly producing gases and chemicals from the decomposition of massive amounts of food. But the most disturbing aspect was how his condition affected his role as a supposed living god. By his final years, Amenhotep III was so physically incapacitated that he couldn't perform basic royal duties or religious ceremonies. He had to be carried everywhere on specially reinforced chairs, couldn't stand for more than a few minutes at a time, and had developed such severe breathing problems that audiences with foreign diplomats had to be cut short, because he would literally pass out from oxygen deprivation. The tragic irony is that his extreme obesity was actually celebrated by court officials as evidence of divine prosperity and abundance. Egyptian propaganda portrayed his massive size as proof that the gods had blessed him with unlimited wealth and resources. Palace artists were ordered to depict him as magnificently proportioned, rather than morbidly obese, creating temple carvings that showed an athletic, godlike figure that bore no resemblance to the reality of a man who had eaten himself into a walking corpse. Ancient medical records reveal that in his final months, Amenhotep III's body had begun decomposing. While he was still alive, his obesity had created conditions where parts of his body couldn't receive adequate blood circulation, causing flesh to die and rot even as his heart continued beating. Palace doctors described treating wounds that wouldn't heal, removing dead tissue from living areas, and dealing with infections that were impossible to cure because the underlying cause was the pharaoh's own body weight crushing his circulatory system. The man history remembers as one of Egypt's greatest pharaohs had literally eaten himself to death in the most grotesque way possible, transforming his divine body into a biological time bomb that would explode with devastating consequences during what was supposed to be his triumphant journey to eternal paradise. If you thought Amenhotep III's morbid obesity was the worst part of this story, prepare to discover how his body began decomposing while he was still alive and conscious, creating a living nightmare that would make modern medical horror stories seem tame in comparison. We're talking about a pharaoh who spent his final months literally watching pieces of his own flesh die and fall off while he remained mentally aware enough to understand what was happening to him. The decomposition process began approximately 2 years before Amenhotep III's actual death, starting with what palace doctors initially dismissed as minor skin irritations on his legs and feet. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. These weren't normal infections or wounds. His extreme obesity had created areas where blood circulation was so poor that tissues simply stopped receiving oxygen and began dying while still attached to his living body. Ancient medical papyri describe the progression with disturbing detail. Small dark spots that gradually expanded into patches of dead. Blackened flesh that would eventually separate from healthy tissue and fall off in chunks. But wait, the medical horror escalated in ways that defied ancient Egyptian understanding of disease and death. Within months, the necrosis had spread up his legs and across his torso, creating a patchwork of living and dead tissue that made Amenhotep III appear like a walking corpse. Palace servants reported that pieces of the pharaoh's skin would literally fall off during royal audiences, creating situations where foreign diplomats had to pretend not to notice chunks of royal flesh dropping onto the floor while conducting serious political negotiations. And here, the truly disturbing part. The smell of decomposition became so overwhelming that the palace had to be constantly fumigated with massive amounts of incense and aromatic oils. Contemporary accounts describe the odor as worse than battlefields covered with week-old corpses, and so penetrating that it could be detected from outside the palace walls. Servants drew straws to determine who would have to attend the pharaoh directly, because prolonged exposure to the smell caused violent nausea. And what ancient texts describe as sickness of the mind, probably what we would now recognize as trauma-induced psychological disorders. The most grotesque aspect was how the mummification process had to begin while Amenhotep III was still alive. Egyptian embalmers, faced with a body that was already partially decomposed, began applying preservative substances to areas of living tissue in desperate attempts to slow the rot the pharaoh had to endure, having his still living flesh treated with the same chemicals normally used on corpses, creating a bizarre situation where he was simultaneously alive and being prepared for death. Palace records reveal that Amenhotep III's condition created unprecedented challenges for royal protocol. How do you maintain the divine image of a living god whose body is visibly... Court officials developed elaborate systems of concealment using heavy makeup, artificial skin coverings, and strategic positioning during public appearances to hide the worst areas of decomposition. Foreign ambassadors were required to approach the throne from specific angles that minimized their view of the pharaoh's deteriorating condition. But the psychological horror was even worse than the physical decay. Ancient texts describe Amenhotep III's growing awareness that he was literally dying piece by piece, combined with his desperate attempts to maintain royal dignity, while his body betrayed him in the most humiliating ways possible. Palace doctors recorded his increasingly frantic demands for treatments, cures, and magical interventions to stop the decomposition process that had already progressed beyond any possibility of reversal. The religious implications were catastrophic for Egyptian theology. If pharaohs were living gods with divine bodies, blessed by the gods themselves, how could those same bodies begin rotting before death? Palace priests struggled to explain the unexplainable, creating increasingly elaborate theological justifications for why their divine ruler was decomposing alive. Some claimed it was a test of faith. Others suggested it was preparation for a more perfect resurrection. But privately, many began questioning the entire foundation of Egyptian religious beliefs. The most disturbing records describe Amenhotep III's final months, when the decomposition had progressed so far that he was essentially a conscious mind trapped in a partially dead body. He could see, hear, and think clearly, but large portions of his physical form had already entered the decay processes normally associated with death. Palace servants reported conversations where the pharaoh would calmly discuss affairs of state while casually brushing away pieces of his own dead flesh that had separated during the discussion. This was just medical deterioration. It was a preview of the biological processes that would ultimately lead to his corpse, becoming a literal explosive device during his funeral ceremony. If you thought ancient Egyptian funerals were dignified, solemn ceremonies befitting divine rulers, prepared to witness the most catastrophic and physically revolting public disaster in ancient history. We'll be talking about the moment when Amenhotep III's decomposing corpse literally detonated. During his state funeral was such explosive force that eyewitnesses described it as divine judgment made manifest through the most grotesque spectacle ever witnessed by human eyes. The funeral ceremony had been planned for months as the grandest celebration of pharaonic power ever staged. Over 10,000 people packed into the sacred temple complex, including foreign royalty, high priests, military commanders, and representatives from every province of the Egyptian empire. The atmosphere was reverent and expectant as priests prepared to present the God King as mummified remains of the deities for eternal blessing. Instead, they were about to witness something so traumatic that many would never recover psychologically. Here is the exact sequence of events that turned a divine ceremony into a nightmare. The explosion occurred during the most sacred moment of the ritual, when the high priest was lifting the pharaoh's sarcophagus to present it to the sun god Ra. Contemporary chronicles describe how the golden coffin suddenly began making strange sounds, what witnesses described as groaning like a wounded beast, and hissing like 1,000 serpents. The sounds grew louder and more disturbing, until even the priests conducting the ceremony began backing away in confusion and terror. But wait, the visual horror escalated beyond anything the witnesses could have prepared for. Eyewitnesses reported that the sarcophagus began visibly swelling and expanding, as if something inside was growing larger and pushing against the golden walls. The metal began creaking and bending outward in impossible ways, while a putrid liquid started seeping from the joints and seams. The smell, already overwhelming from the decomposing corpse, became so intense that people in the front rows began feigning and vomiting uncontrollably. And here, as the moment of absolute catastrophe. Ancient texts describe a sound louder than thunder, followed by a spray of decomposed flesh, bodily fluids, and mummy wrappings that covered everyone within a 200-foot radius. The golden sarcophagus was blown apart into fragments that flew through the air like deadly projectiles, embedding themselves in temple walls and striking down several priests and attendees who were too close to the blast zone. The immediate aftermath was beyond comprehension for people who had never witnessed anything like it. Chunks of the pharaoh's rotted flesh landed on sacred altars, splattered across religious statues, and covered the faces and clothing of foreign dignitaries who had come to pay respects to what they believed was a divine being. The force of the explosion was so great that pieces of Amenhotep III were later found embedded in the ceiling of the temple, over 60 feet above where the sarcophagus had been positioned. Palace guards and priests frantically tried to maintain order as thousands of witnesses fled in panic, trampling each other in desperate attempts to escape what they interpreted as supernatural punishment. Many believed they were witnessing the gods themselves rejecting the pharaoh in the most violent and humiliating way possible. Foreign ambassadors, covered in royal decomposed flesh, fled the temple, convinced they had been cursed by association with whatever divine wrath had caused such an unprecedented disaster. The cleanup process was as horrifying as the explosion itself. Temple servants had to scrape pieces of the pharaoh off walls, floors, and religious artifacts using tools normally reserved for cleaning animal sacrifices. The sacred temple, which had been consecrated as one of Egypt's holiest sites, was now contaminated with scattered chunks of rotted royal flesh. That had to be collected in baskets and buckets like debris from a construction accident. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect was the sound witnesses described hearing during and after the explosion. Ancient chronicles record that survivors reported hearing what sounded like screaming coming from the scattered remains, as if the pharaoh's spirit was experiencing agony, even after his body had been blown apart. This may have been gases escaping from decomposed tissue, but two witnesses already traumatized by seeing their god king explode. It seemed like evidence that Amenhotep III was suffering eternal torment for some unimaginable sin. The explosion was so traumatic and unprecedented that it became a defining moment in Egyptian history, fundamentally challenging beliefs about divine pharaohs and the sanctity of royal burial practices. Instead of ascending to eternal paradise as planned, Amenhotep III had been literally blown apart in front of his own people. creating a spectacle so grotesque that it would be remembered and discussed for centuries as proof that even gods could be destroyed in the most humiliating ways imaginable. If you thought the explosion of Amenhotep III's corpse was just a bizarre historical curiosity, prepare to discover how this single grotesque event fundamentally destroyed the entire foundation of ancient Egyptian religious belief and triggered a theological crisis that would ultimately lead to the collapse of one of history's most enduring civilizations. We be talking about how the sight of their supposedly divine ruler literally exploding in front of thousands of witnesses shattered 3,000 years of religious orthodoxy in a matter of seconds. The immediate psychological impact on witnesses was catastrophic and unprecedented in Egyptian history. For over 3 millennia, Egyptians had believed without question that their pharaohs were living gods whose bodies were sacred vessels blessed by divine power and destined for eternal paradise. In one horrifying moment, that entire belief system was obliterated as thousands of people watched their reduced to scattered chunks of rotting flesh that had to be scraped off temple walls with shovels and buckets. Here's the religious catastrophe that followed. Within days of the explosion, reports began flooding in from across the Egyptian empire of mass abandonment of temples, priests resigning their positions, and entire communities refusing to participate in traditional religious ceremonies. If pharaohs could explode during the most sacred funeral rites, witnessed by the gods themselves, what did that say about divine protection, eternal life, and the entire Egyptian understanding of death and the afterlife? The explosion had essentially proved that everything Egyptians believed about their rulers and their religion was fundamentally wrong. But wait! The theological implications became even more devastating as news of the explosion spread throughout the ancient world. Foreign kingdoms that had previously paid tribute to Egypt as a divinely blessed empire began questioning whether they should continue acknowledging Egyptian supremacy. If Egyptian gods couldn't even protect their own pharaoh from exploding during his funeral, how could they possibly protect Egypt itself? Diplomatic records show that several vassal states immediately stopped sending tribute and began making military preparations for potential Egyptian collapse. And here, the most destructive long-term consequence. The explosion triggered what historians now recognize as the first recorded theological revolution in human history. Priests throughout Egypt began developing new religious doctrines to explain the unexplainable, but their attempts only created more confusion and contradiction. Some claimed the explosion was proof that Amenhotep III had been secretly cursed for unknown sins. Others argued it was a test of faith, designed by the gods to separate true believers from doubters. Still others suggested that traditional mummification practices had somehow offended the deities. The crisis deepened when attempts to cover up or reinterpret the explosion failed completely. Too many people had witnessed the event firsthand, and their traumatic testimonies spread faster than official palace propaganda could contain them. Foreign ambassadors returned to their home countries with detailed accounts of seeing an Egyptian pharaoh literally blown apart during a sacred ceremony, destroying Egypt's international reputation as a divinely protected civilization and encouraging neighboring kingdoms to view Egypt as vulnerable to conquest. Palace officials made desperate attempts to restore religious authority by claiming the explosion was actually a sign of divine approval, arguing that Amenhotep III had been so blessed by the gods that his spirit had departed his body with explosive force to join them in paradise. But this explanation was so obviously ridiculous that it only further undermined official credibility and convinced more people that Egyptian religious leaders were either delusional or deliberately lying about divine matters. The most devastating long-term impact was on Egyptian burial practices and beliefs about the afterlife. 4 centuries after the explosion, Egyptian families began questioning whether traditional mummification and funeral rites actually protected the dead or potentially cursed them. Demand for traditional burial services collapsed as people feared their own loved ones might suffer similar explosive fates. The entire Egyptian funeral industry, which had employed thousands of people and represented a massive portion of the economy, began disintegrating as customers sought alternative burial methods. Archaeological evidence shows that within a generation of Amenhotep III's explosion, Egyptian religious practices had become fragmented and contradictory in ways that would have been unthinkable before the incident. Different regions began developing incompatible interpretations of traditional beliefs, competing groups of priests emerged with conflicting doctrines, and the unified religious system that had held Egyptian civilization together for millennia began splitting into factions that would ultimately weaken the empire beyond repair. The explosion also had profound psychological effects on Egyptian society that extended far beyond religion. Ancient texts describe a generation of Egyptians who became obsessed with the possibility of post-mortem bodily destruction, leading to widespread anxiety about death and burial that affected everything from military morale to economic productivity. The confident, unified Egyptian worldview that had made the empire so powerful and stable was replaced by doubt, fear, and theological confusion that made the civilization increasingly vulnerable to external conquest and internal collapse. The ultimate irony is that Amenhotep III's explosion accomplished what no foreign army, natural disaster, or political crisis had ever achieved. It destroyed the religious foundation of Egyptian civilization from within, proving that sometimes the most devastating defeats come not from external enemies, but from the spectacular failure of a society's most fundamental beliefs. Now that you've witnessed the complete religious and social devastation caused by Amenhotep III's explosive funeral, it is time for the final revelation that'll completely change your understanding of this historical nightmare. What happened was supernatural punishment or divine wrath. It was a perfect storm of biological processes, ancient embalming techniques, and environmental conditions that created what was essentially a human bomb. And it could theoretically happen again under the same circumstances. Based on modern forensic analysis of the mummy remains and contemporary Egyptian medical records, Amenhotep III's explosion was the result of a lethal combination of factors that ancient Egyptians could understood. His extreme obesity had created the perfect conditions for anaerobic bacterial fermentation inside his body cavity. When combined with the specific chemicals used in his mummification process and the environmental conditions during his funeral, his corpse became a biological pressure cooker that was mathematically destined to explode. Here is the scientific explanation that makes this even more disturbing. Amenhotep III's body had been fermenting from the inside for months before his death. His massive consumption of fermented beverages, honey, and fruit had created a gut microbiome dominated by gas-producing bacteria that continued functioning even after death. These bacteria, sealed inside his body cavity by the mummification process, continued producing methane, hydrogen sulfide, and other volatile gases that gradually built up enormous pressure inside the sealed corpse. But wait. The mummification process itself made the situation exponentially worse. Egyptian embalmers had used unprecedented quantities of nitron, salt, resin, and aromatic oils on Amenhotep III's body due to its advanced state of decomposition. These chemicals, designed to preserve the corpse, actually created airtight seals that trapped gases inside while simultaneously providing fuel for continued bacterial fermentation. The pharaoh's corpse had essentially become a sealed biological reactor producing explosive gases under increasing pressure. And here is the truly scientific horror. The explosion was triggered by temperature changes during the funeral ceremony. Ancient Egyptian funerals were timed to coincide with the hottest part of the day to honor the sun god, Ra. As the temperature inside the temple rose, it caused the gases trapped in Amenhotep II's body to expand rapidly, while the resinous mummification materials became more volatile. The combination of expanding gases and heating chemicals created conditions similar to a controlled demolition, but using a human corpse as the explosive device. Modern forensic experts have calculated that the internal pressure in Amenhotep III's body cavity would have reached approximately 45 pounds per square inch before the explosion. Enough force to blow apart the golden sarcophagus and scatter body parts with the velocity described in ancient accounts. The methane and hydrogen sulfide gases would have created the horrific smell that traumatized witnesses, while the rapid expansion of heated gases produced the explosive sound that ancient chroniclers compared to thunder. The specific trajectory and distribution of body parts described in eyewitness accounts actually confirms the scientific explanation. Forensic analysis shows that the explosion originated in the pharaoh's abdominal cavity and radiated outward in a pattern consistent with a gas-powered blast. The fact that larger pieces of the corpse were found embedded in the temple ceiling, while smaller fragments scattered across a wide area matches exactly what modern explosion experts would predict from this type of biological detonation. But here is the most chilling scientific reality. This type of explosion was entirely preventable with proper mummification techniques. If Egyptian embalmers had understood anaerobic bacterial processes, they would have vented the gas buildup or used different preservation chemicals that didn't create airtight seals. The explosion happened because ancient science was unadvanced enough to recognize the dangers of sealing fermentation processes inside human bodies. The medical evidence also reveals the true extent of Amenhotep III's physical deterioration before death. Modern analysis of his remains shows that he suffered from severe diabetes, heart disease, kidney failure, and multiple infections that had literally caused portions of his body to necrotize while he was still alive. His obesity had created conditions where normal biological processes became pathological, setting up the fermentation cascade that would ultimately destroy his corpse in the most spectacular way possible. The ultimate scientific irony is that Amenhotep III's explosion was the direct result of the very lifestyle that had made him famous for wealth and power. His excessive consumption, his refusal to moderate his diet despite obvious health problems, and his insistence on the most elaborate mummification process available, all combined to create the perfect conditions for post-mortem detonation. He literally ate himself into becoming a human bomb that would explode centuries of religious belief along with his own body. This wasn't divine punishment or supernatural intervention. It was basic biochemistry operating under extreme conditions, proving that sometimes the most shocking historical events have perfectly rational scientific explanations that are somehow even more disturbing than any religious or mythological interpretation could ever be. So there you have the devastating truth behind one of the most grotesque and historically significant events ever documented. Amenhotep III was unremembered as the great pharaoh of Egypt's Golden Age. He became the man who literally exploded during his own funeral and destroyed 3,000 years of religious belief in a matter of seconds. The cruelest irony. The pharaoh who ruled during the height of Egyptian civilization, who built magnificent temples and commanded an empire spanning 3 continents, will forever be remembered as the man too fat who transformed into a human bomb. His legacy was beyond his achievements or monuments. It was proving that not even gods can escape the basic laws of biology when they take excess to the absolute extreme. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of this story is its modern relevance. The combination that destroyed Amenhotep III, extreme obesity, diabetes, uncontrolled bacterial fermentation, still kills people today. The difference is that now we understand the scientific processes behind the horror. Amenhotep III experienced every phase of this deterioration without any understanding of what was happening to his own body. His story isn't just about a pharaoh who exploded. It's about how absolute power can blind someone to the consequences of their own choices until it's too late. It's about how even the deepest beliefs can be destroyed by a single moment of undeniable reality. And it's about how science can explain even the most apparently supernatural events in history. Amenhotep III spent decades believing he was an immortal god, only to discover he was as mortal and vulnerable as any common person. Actually more vulnerable due to the very choices he made with his divine power. He became an explosive demonstration that there are some natural laws that not even pharaohs can break with impunity. The next time you think about absolute power and its limits, remember, Amenhotep III, the god king who proved that sometimes human hubris can be punished in ways more spectacular and humiliating than any divine punishment could ever imagine. And this is just one of many shocking truths that ancient history hides behind royal propaganda and religious myths. If this case made you question everything you thought you knew about divine pharaohs and the power of ancient civilizations, then you're ready to discover more secrets that will make this seem like just the beginning. Because the real history of humanity, it's full of horrors that make exploding royal corpses seem mild in comparison. History hides its darkest truths in plain sight. If you want to uncover the next forbidden secret, hit like and subscribe right now.